Hello everyone and welcome to Lecture 6 Extensive Form Games with Perfect Information. I'm David Smerdon and you're probably wondering what's going on with this guy up here. We'll get to him soon, but I thought I would leave this background up there as some sort of curious teaser to spark your attention as we go through. So what are we going to do today? We're going to introduce the concept of extensive form games, and particularly how this relates to sequential games. We'll talk about the Pirates example from last week, a bit about football, its application to game theory, and more. But before we get into that, a very important announcement about the mid-semester exam. Now this semester, of course, it's no longer a typical mid-semester exam. It's going to be called an online take-home assignment, but it is essentially the same exam questions. So I would consider this to be a pretty good outcome for you, to be honest. It covers lectures 1 to 6. It'll be held on April the 22nd during the normal lecture time. In order to get the assignment, you need to go onto Blackboard, into the assessment menu item, and there's already some information there about the take-home assignment, some instructions to read, and I highly advise you read those in advance. And then on the 22nd at 12 o'clock precisely, the assignment questions will appear, and there is also the submission link on Turnitin that you can upload your document into, and your deadline is 3 p.m. Now, it was normally scheduled to be a 90 minutes exam, and I wrote the questions with the mindset that you would have an hour and a half to do them. So I doubt that you will have any problems reaching that deadline if you start when you should at 12 p.m. It's open book. You can look at all the notes from this lecture. You can use the textbook. You can use the tutorial materials, but you cannot communicate with each other during the exam window, and you cannot Google. Now, obviously, there's an element of trust here, but I think that you shouldn't have too many problems so long as you follow these guidelines and do your study beforehand. Okay, a little checklist because it is an online take-home assessment. Make sure your internet's working. Make sure you know how to set up a mobile hotspot just in case things go down with your Wi-Fi. If you want to draw graphs and payoff tables by hand like you would in an assignment, make sure that you either have a scanner or that you can take photos on your phone and you know how to insert those as objects into a Word document. It's very easy to do. Or alternatively, you know how to draw digital graphs and tables. Just make sure you know how to do one of these things. Okay, what about the challenge from last week, the Pirates game? So there are 3 pirates, you, Captain Barbossa, and Jack Sparrow. You arrive from your looting and plundering with 100 pieces of gold, and you have to decide how to split them. Now, the code of honor among pirates says that there is a proposal voting system for allocating these coins, the treasure, and it also revolves around the strict leadership structure in place. So you are more senior than Captain Barbossa, who is more senior than Jack Sparrow. The voting goes as follows. The highest ranked pirate, in this case you, offers the first proposal, the split of the gold, and then you have to come up with some allocation, and then all of the pirates vote on whether to accept the split or not. And if there's a tie, the proposer holds the casting vote. So the more senior pirate holds the tie-breaking vote. If the pirates agree to the split, it happens. If they don't agree, the proposer is thrown overboard, and then the next most senior pirate takes over the role of proposer, and the process repeats until one proposal is accepted. So We need to know what the payoffs are, the preferences of each pirate, and it's pretty straightforward. You want to stay alive, conditional on staying alive, you want to get rich. So what should you do? If you are, let's call you player A, we'll call Captain Barbosa player B, and Jack Sparrow player C, so that's going in order of leadership hierarchy. What's the best that you can do? You want to stay alive, of course, but you want gold. Well, I hope you had a think about this. If you didn't, pause the video now and try to come up with your best solution. When I tried this in class in previous semesters and asked students what they thought, some were quite conservative, offering player B just a few coins. Some would even, offering player B most of the coins and only taking a few coins for themselves. Some were even more conservative, offering a 50-50 split for B and C and not taking anything for themselves just in order to stay alive. But you can actually do very well here as the first proposer. To solve this game, or at least to optimize your decision, you need to think about what others will do. So once again, you need to put yourself in their shoes. And then you need to work backwards, which is going to be a key theme for today's lecture. So think about what happens if your proposal is rejected. Okay, you might think, well, then I'm thrown overboard and I drown. Why do I care what happens after that? I'm dead. Well, that's not the point. The point to work out your best decision now is to work out what others would do in the future and then take advantage of that by thinking about backwards steps. So what would happen in the event of your untimely seafaring death at the hands of these ruthless pirates? What would happen in that situation? Well, there's B, who will make the next proposal, and C. They will vote on the proposal, and if it's a tie, then B has the deciding vote. So essentially, it's not really a vote at all because it's like B owns 51% of the company or whatever. Because of the tie-breaking arrangement, whatever B says will go, whether or not C disagrees. So given that, it's quite easy to work out what B will do. B will take everything for himself and give C 0 coins. And the final outcome will be 100 to B, 0 to C, and of course you got nothing, you're drowned now. But we need to know this because putting ourselves in the minds of B and C help us. Now, if B rejects whatever proposal we give, B ends up with 100. So what can we do to incentivize B to accept our proposal? Well, nothing. I mean, he's going to get 100 if he rejects us. We could offer him 100. That's it. That's the best we can do. Okay, what about C? Well, C is really getting a bad deal in the situation where C rejects our proposal. C is getting 0. So knowing that C is getting 0, we just need to do something to encourage C to get a slightly better deal than 0. And that will be enough for C to accept our proposal. So we can just offer C 1 coin, just 1. That's enough because it's more than what C would get if C votes against us. And then we don't need B's vote. So what we do is we propose that C gets 1 and we keep all the rest. B rejects, B was going to reject anyway, but C is on our side and that's all we need. So not only do we stay alive, but we come out of it really well with 99 coins. Okay, cool. Pretty straightforward. Let's try a more advanced version. What if there are 5 pirates, A, B, C, D, and E? Have a think about this, use the technique we just saw, and we'll discuss this in the next lecture. So let's move on now. We've looked at simultaneous moves in a normal form game. That's what we've been discussing so far. So player I chooses her action. She does not know the action chosen by the other players. She would know their equilibrium actions, but not what happens if they play off their equilibrium. What if we want to consider situations where some players can observe the choice of other players before taking their decision? let's take the example from football. Now, if you know football, or soccer as we call it in Australia and the US, there's often a situation where there's what we call a penalty kick. And you can also think about this in terms of tennis. You have a server and a receiver. The server has to choose whether to serve down the middle or out wide. The receiver has to choose whether to, on reflex, go more to the center or stand more out wide. There's many other similar situations in sport. So in soccer, there's the shooter or the kicker, there's the goalkeeper trying to save the penalty. And the kicker, who's trying to score the goal, can choose typically whether to kick to the left corner or to the right corner. We'll talk about this from the goalkeeper's perspective. So to the goalkeeper's left or to the goalkeeper's right. And the goalkeeper, who needs to move very quickly because the ball is coming at 100 miles an hour, the goalkeeper needs to decide in advance in professional soccer whether to dive to the left or dive to the right. Now, if the kicker kicks to the same corner that the goalkeeper dives to, the goalkeeper has a pretty good chance of stopping the ball. If the kicker kicks to the opposite corner that the goalkeeper dives to, then the goalkeeper typically is not going to be able to stop the ball. So the fact that the kicker kicks first doesn't actually make too much difference in terms of whether this game is sequential or not. And that's because the ball goes so fast that both need to make their decisions pretty much simultaneously. The goalkeeper has no information by the time he makes his decision. Okay, so let's imagine that these are the payoffs. That is, if the goalkeeper dives to his right, but the kicker kicks to the goalkeeper's left, then it's not a match for the goalkeeper. He's gone the wrong direction. The goalkeeper gets -1, the kicker scores and gets 1, and so forth. We've seen this payoff table before. So let's just quickly test your recall. How many pure strategy Nash equilibria are there, and how many mixed strategy Nash equilibria? Well, you should have been able to remember that there are no pure strategy Nash equilibria in this game, which is, by the way, known as the matching pennies game. But there is one mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, and that is when both players they randomize with probabilities of a half between their two different actions. So a half, and a half, that together is the mixed strategy Nash equilibrium for this game. Now, off-equilibrium play can be exploited in this case. So if we go back to the framing of the mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, each player wins with probability of a half. And now I want you to imagine what you would do if you are player 1 and player 2 doesn't mix in perfect 50-50 proportions. Imagine that player 2 plays heads with probability 60% and tails with probability 40%. Then what's the best you can do as player 1? Should you also change your probabilities? Should you change them to some sort of 60-40 combination? Can you do better than that? Well, the best that you can do is to play heads all the time. If your opponent plays heads a little bit more than 0.5, then you playing heads is strictly better than you playing tails in this situation. So you should play heads all the time, 100%, and not just change your probability a little bit. And a more intuitive way to think about this is the game rock, paper, scissors. Remember that? Rock, paper, scissors, this game. Now, as we've seen, and as you could probably guess, the Nash equilibrium here is that you play each of your 3 actions with equal probability, and your opponent the same. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Now, what if you're playing this game against someone and you know beforehand, your friend whispers to you, hey, you're playing against David. He tends to play rock a little bit more than the others. So what should you do? Well, you should choose paper. Not some mixture, not sometimes paper, all the time paper. because you know that I'm more likely to play rock than anything else. Okay, so you switch to a pure strategy to exploit their playing off the equilibrium path. And what that means is that these particular mixed strategy Nash equilibria are quite unstable. They exist and we can pinpoint them, but any deviation from another person is going to lead to a big shift by the opponent. So what that means is that empirically, if there is some situation, some game in which the solution should follow mixed strategy Nash equilibria, even though the players of this game in real life are not game theorists or mathematicians or robots, over time with their experience, they should play very close to the Nash equilibrium prediction, because if they don't, they'll be punished to a large extent. So let's see whether this really happens. A paper that some economists put out a couple of decades ago was about professional football. Now, professional footballers are not mathematicians, they're not game theorists, they don't have training in ECON7070, but they are paid tens of millions of dollars, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars to play football. They're very good at football. They play it a lot. They are experienced in these games. And as we've seen in some of the lab experiments, with experience and the right incentives, players tend to converge towards the Nash equilibrium predictions. So do we find this in the case of penalty shootouts, where the theory says that we should end up in a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium? Otherwise, some players would be extremely disadvantaged. If the goalkeeper, for example, is diving the wrong way out of proportion, then over time that goalkeeper will be easily exploited by the penalty kickers, and presumably that goalkeeper would get sacked. Same for the scorers. Well, we can actually, what these economists did, what these researchers did, they took a lot of data from penalty shootouts in the Champions League, in the Premier League, in the Bundesliga, German soccer league, and they looked at the theoretical predictions about what the mixed strategy proportions should be. The way we've looked at it, it's been P and 1 minus P, Q and 1 minus Q. And then they looked at what the actual frequencies were from the different players. So this, for example, is the proportion of the time that the goalkeeper has dived to his left, the proportion of the time the goalkeeper has dived to his right, the proportion of the time the kicker has kicked to his left, and so forth. Now in this game, the payoffs are in terms of the expected chance of scoring, and they're not exactly 50-50 like in matching pennies, because, for example, for a right-footed kicker, you have higher chances of scoring against a goalkeeper in one corner versus another, just because you can kick a little bit faster and more accurately towards that corner. So that's why we don't have 50-50. But the key point is to compare between the predicted frequency, which is here, and the actual frequency. And what we see is that the players in all of these leagues with all of these kicks are playing very, very similar to the Nash predictions. And if they don't, if individual players don't, can they be exploited? Well, the author, one of the researchers who wrote this paper, was actually contacted by Chelsea. Chelsea is one of the biggest and richest football clubs in the world, based in the suburb of London, playing in the English Premier League and also the Champions League, the worldwide clubs competition. And so this researcher was contacted and they said, look, we would like a little bit of help for our penalty shootouts, in particular for our upcoming match in the Champions League. Now, the Champions League is the largest and richest football competition in the world. It's held every year. It's incredibly lucrative, watched by billions of people around the world. And in this particular final in 2008, two of the richest and most decorated clubs in the world were competing against each other. They were both English. There was Manchester United. I think it's currently worth about 5 to 6 billion euros as a corporation, and Chelsea. Now, both of these clubs earn income of around $1 billion Australian dollars a year. They're incredibly wealthy clubs. So they had the money to pay a poor, lowly economist, game theorist, for some advice. So they were playing in the final, which was held, I believe, in Moscow. And there was the chance that if the match was tied and extra time was tied, they would go to a penalty shootout. A penalty shootout, again, you've got the kicker, you've got the goalkeeper, and they wanted to see whether there was a way that they could maximize their chances of winning if it got to that point. So the game theorist did a bit of research. He looked at the Manchester players, he looked at the Chelsea players, and he realized that the Manchester United goalkeeper, one of the best goalkeepers in the world, wasn't exactly diving in the proportions that Nash equilibrium would suggest. He was a little bit off, which meant that he could be exploited. And so what they said, what the researcher, the game theorist, said was the Manchester United goalkeeper dives to his right a little bit too often, a little bit too frequency. Maybe he should be diving there 55% of the time, and he's diving there 57% of the time. Not a big difference, but it's in your best interest to always kick to the goalkeeper's left. All the time, kick to the goalkeeper's left. Now think about it in terms of rock, paper, scissors. If you know that they're playing rock a little bit too often, then every time you should be playing paper. So that he said to them, every time you kick to the goalkeeper's left. So the players went away with that information. Then the Chelsea goalkeeper approached the economist and said, what about me? Which way should I dive? Is there some way I can take advantage of their kickers? And the game theorist said, no, not really. Actually, the Manchester United kickers are almost perfect as a team in the way that they randomize between kicking to your left or to your right. There's not much that we can do about that, except that their absolute star player, a young player called Cristiano Ronaldo, not so young anymore, but still a star, sometimes he adjusts his run-up so that he pauses a bit in his run-up. He stutters and then he kicks. And when he does that, he's more likely to kick to your right than normal. He doesn't randomize as much. And the goalkeeper said, okay, thanks very much for that. So what happens? Well, they go to Moscow, they play the final. After 90 minutes, it's tied. They play extra time. After another 30 minutes, it's still tied. So they go to penalty shootouts. Now, the way that a penalty shootout works is there's one kicker from one team, there's the goalkeeper of the other team. The kicker kicks, he either scores or he doesn't, and then they swap. So the other team's goalkeeper goes out, the first team's goalkeeper goes in, and the other team's kicker comes. So one kicker from one team, then it's one kicker from the other team, and so forth. The first to get to 5 wins. 5 goals wins. And if it's tied at 5-5, then it's just 1-1, 1-1, 1-1. One kicker from one team, one kicker from another team, and if it's not tied, if one gets it and the other doesn't, that team wins. Kind of like sudden death. All right, I think you've got all the information. Let's see what happened. Just for way of background, Manchester United are the red team, and Chelsea, the team that recruited the game theorist, is the blue team. And remember, the red team's goalkeeper dives to his right too often, so the blue team was told, kick to the goalkeeper's left. Shall we see what happened? Let's have a look.
Time. And who scores the late goals? It goes to penalties. 1-1 after 90 minutes.
All right, so
and
we're all
1-1
tied
end.
up at extra time. We're going to penalties. Manchester United is kicking first.
And he sends
Scores
Petacek
the
the
first
wrong
goal.
way.
And now we're getting
Good luck,
ready
boys. Chelsea's
for the first of the Chelsea penalties. Now remember, their consultant, their game theorist, said that the goalkeeper, who's one of the best in the world, he's the guy in green there, he dives to his right too often. He dives to his right too often. So let's see what the kicker does.
First penalty.
There you go. To the left.
Van der Sar
scores
thought
the
it was
first
going
goal.
the other way to the
1-0.
one at Stamford Bridge. It did, but Ballack had enough on it. And scores again here. 2-1 Manchester United.
And with the greatest of respect to the Community Shield.
Giuliano Belletti. And everyone's
Goalkeeper's
spot
left
on.
Again, 2-2.
The world is watching.
We've got, let's get his face on screen, Cristiano Ronaldo, who at the time was an extremely talented young Manchester United player who would later go on to be arguably the greatest player in the world. Now, remember what the game theorist said. If Cristiano Ronaldo stutters on his run-up, so he pauses on his run-up, then he is more likely than normal to kick to the goalkeeper's right.
A shimmy. And Cech has saved from Ronaldo of all people.
I told you.
He's taken some pressure penalties before and since and scored. And he drills this one in. And Chelsea rubles. Hargreaves gets it up and over Cech against Van der Sar. Oh, it got in just infinitely less experienced. Nani keeps Manchester United in it.
So are you keeping count? Chelsea are in the lead by 1 goal. It's 1-5. So if John Terry on screen at the moment kicks this, they win. If he scores, they win. Now remember, that's goalkeeper's left. That is the exploitation of the off-equilibrium decisions by the goalkeeper. So you should always kick to the goalkeeper's left, even if your teammates have done so 4 times before. Now, John Terry, for those who are familiar with the football world, he's now a soccer manager, but he was a player for quite some time, played for England, one of the most loathed and reviled football players. While this match, so during the time that this match was going on in 2007, 2008, he was actually secretly having an affair with one of his teammates' wives, and later was also accused of some severe racism towards other players. So we don't like him very much, which is why I like this particular moment quite a lot.
Mr. Chelsea, who has felt the pain of the semi-final defeats in the Champions League for Chelsea, has the chance to win the Champions League for Chelsea. And it's a chance that has passed him by, and the agony is there again.
Watch him slip, Martin.
Goal for Manchester
John
United.
Terry actually did what the game theorist had instructed him to do. He went to the goalkeeper's left. The goalkeeper again went to the right, the wrong direction, but the kicker slipped and missed the open goal. So now we're all tied up again.
But he rams Manchester United back in front in the...
And an instructive moment coming up here. Remember, just like if you are playing rock, paper, scissors and your opponent is playing rock slightly more than 1/3 of the time, but every game, you should keep playing paper. Keep playing paper. Keep playing paper until your opponent modifies their proportions. Now, at this point in time... Oh, wait, I think we've got 2 more kicks first. So these 2 through.
Holds his nerve and holds Chelsea's place in the contest.
Chelsea kicks to the goal.
He hopes a lot more accurate here in Moscow tonight. He is.
Finals like this. Short run.
And now, at this point in time, the goalkeeper is probably getting wise to what's going on. There have been 6 kicks, 6 kicks by Chelsea, and they have all gone to the goalkeeper's left. Now, the goalkeeper, the reason that he was diving throughout his career more often to the right is because he is stronger when he dives to the right. He has a better chance of stopping the ball if it comes to him. But he's noticed something going on, that the kickers are always going to the left. Now, he still wants to play the same mixed strategy in equilibrium, but he wants to somehow encourage the kicker to kick to his right. He wants the kicker to know somehow and be scared of kicking to his left.
Take a short run. But what do I know?
He didn't look happy
Do you
coming
notice what
forward.
he's doing? The goalkeeper is pointing to his left. He's pointing to his left as if to say, I know you're going to kick there. I know you're going to kick there. Now, what should the kicker do?
Anelka, and he's not happy now because it's red in Russia, Champions League. Thanks to Edwin van der Sar's save.
And I think
Ronaldo's
that's a perfect scene to finish that on. I think we might leave that up for the rest of the lecture, actually. So the kicker should still have maintained the same strategy of kicking to the goalkeeper's left, but he was put off. He played an irrationally fearful action, switched strategies, kicked to the goalkeeper's right, which is where the goalkeeper dived, and believe it or not, that was the end of the Champions League ambitions for Chelsea. So quite an interesting example of game theory in action. You might think, well, it's not such an important thing, it's only football, but again, these are billion-dollar companies. Okay, can I really go with the whole lecture with Cristiano Ronaldo's face back there? I think probably I can. I think, why not? Okay, so let's get back to it then. One moment. There we are. Timing seems to matter in the games that we follow. So we've got our mixed strategy game, which we've seen before, and we know that there's a unique mixed strategy equilibrium. In this game, it's with both players mixing with probability of a half. In football, it might be mixing with slightly different probabilities, but we know from our theorem that there must be at least one Nash equilibrium, and if there cannot be a pure strategy one, it must be a mixed strategy one. But what if instead of playing sequentially, making your decisions at the same time, players take turns to make their decisions, and you can see the other person's decision before you make yours. So not in football, where the ball comes so quickly that you don't have time to see it. This time, you actually see the other person's decision. Sorry, I just cut out my hand before. I want to make sure my hand's still there. You actually see your opponent's decision, and then you make the choice of what to do. So what happens if we had the matching pennies game, but player 1 moves first, and then player 2 can see the choice? Well, in the matching pennies game, there is a huge advantage to going second, to seeing this information. You just see what the other person chooses, you choose your best response, the other player has no chance to change their mind, so player 2 is going to win in any equilibrium. And this is something we haven't seen so far. What we call this sort of game is an extensive form game. That's different to the normal form games we've seen so far. So this is a game that is characterized by perfect information, which is what we had before. All players observe and remember all past actions by other players. And perfect recall. Each player remembers her own past actions. And we represent an extensive form game differently to the payoff matrices we've seen so far. We represent them using a game tree. This is how you write a game tree. You start with a dot, a good place to start, And this is actually called a node. The dots are called nodes. And this is the root node. Root, in terms of a tree, that's where the tree starts from. We need to know who is the player moving at the root. So we put a number or a letter or a name to represent who the player is who makes the decision at the node, in this case the root node. And those decisions, as we know, represent actions. So we draw out these branches of the tree to represent the different actions. And instead of labeling the columns or the rows as we saw before, now we label those branches with those same column or row names to represent those actions. So here, player 1 at the root node can play 3 different actions: top, bottom, or out. Now, after playing those actions, it will be the time for either that player again, or typically another player, normally it's another player, to make a decision. So that node is a decision node. And here we have 2 decision nodes that happen after playing top or playing bottom. But after playing out in this particular game, the game ends, so there are no more decisions. We write the player to move at each decision node. So here, after playing top, player 3, it's player 3's turn to choose. If player 1 plays bottom, it's player 2's turn to choose. And if player 1 plays out, there are no decision nodes because nobody else is choosing. And we can continue like this to draw a game tree. Something of an ugly tree in this case, but it is a game tree. A sequence of actions determines what we call a history, a game history. Now, at the very end of a particular sequence of actions, we have a termination node, or what we call a terminal node, the very last point. Not a decision node, no one's making a decision here, it's the end of the game. So if player 1 plays out, we immediately reach a terminal node. This tree is made up of its root node, its branches, and then just before the terminal node, the leaves, just like in a tree. So we're almost there. We've almost built up the entire tree. We're just missing these final things down here, which we call the payoff functions. We know about the payoffs before. So at the end of a terminal node, we have the payoff functions. So we have almost the same details. Well, we definitely have exactly the same details as our normal form payoff matrix, but we have a bit more information here. We have these orders, this ordering effect, starting at a root, branching through the branches and getting to the terminal nodes. Let's look at a very simple example of an extensive form game now. We'll call this the father and son game. There is a father, player 1. There is a son, player 1. There is a father, player 2. And the father does not approve of the son's girlfriend. The son has to choose between ending the relationship with his girlfriend or not. If he ends the relationship, the game ends. The son gets a payoff of 1. The father is happy. The father gets a payoff of 2. If the son does not end the relationship, it's the father's turn to choose. The father can disown the son, disinherit the son. You're no longer my son, get out of my family. Both get a payoff of 0. Neither is very happy with this. If he does not disown the son and he accepts the girlfriend, the son gets 2 and the father only gets 1. So it's better for the father than disowning the son, but worse than if the son had ended the relationship. Let's try to draw this game tree. Well, the son moves first, and we know what his decision is. His decision is to choose between end and continue. So we're going to draw our root node. We're going to label the decision maker, who is the son, S. And we're going to draw branches where we label the actions that can be chosen, end or continue the relationship. Now, if end occurs, there's no more decision to be made. That's a terminal node. And if there's a terminal node, we should put in those payoffs. Those payoffs we can see are 1 to the son and 2 to the father. Now, if the son chooses to continue his relationship, we now reach a decision node. At that decision node, it's the father's turn to decide, so we get F. And the choice, we again draw two branches and we draw the actions. They are disown or accept, D and A. Both of these are terminal nodes, and therefore we can put the payoffs under each one. If disown, it's 0, 0, and if accept, the son gets 2 and the father gets 1. So this is the complete game tree for the father-son game. Let's draw a second one now. Let's draw sequential matching pennies. There are two players, 1 and 2. Player 1 moves first, puts a penny on the table, either heads or tails. Player 2 moves second, having seen player 1's decision, and puts another penny with either heads or tails. Player 1 wins if the pennies match. Player 2 wins if the pennies don't match. So what you can do now is actually try to draw this tree for yourself. Pause the video now and try to draw it. So let's draw the game. We start with a root node and we put the player who makes the decision, and that's player 1. Player 1 can make two decisions. We draw those branches and we put the actions, heads and tails. At the end of each of these branches is a decision node with player 2's choice. Player 2 can choose between two actions. Now, very important, what I've done here is I've labeled player 2's actions with capital letters along the branch where player 1 plays heads, and small letters along the branch where player 1 plays tails. Now, I've just done this because it's going to make this easier when we rewrite this extensive form game tree into its normal form equivalent, which you'll see soon. But just be aware that these are still player 2's choices. They are player 2's choices, HT, HT. I've just put capital letters if player 1 first plays heads. And know that for player 1's choices, I've actually written out the full word, heads and tails. Okay, so now we've got 4 terminal nodes, and we can put those payoffs down at the end of each node. Remember, if they happen to match, like heads and heads, then player 1 wins with a payoff of 1, and player 2 is unhappy at payoff of -1. Okay, so in this game, we can already see there seems to be an advantage to going second. A way to think about this is in terms of contingent plans. What's a contingent plan? Well, contingent plan, imagine that player 2 falls sick on the day that he's supposed to come to UQ and play matching pennies against player 1. His twin brother volunteers to go and play for him under his original player 2's instructions. So player 2 can write down a contingent plan for his brother to follow, kind of like a list of instructions. And the plan needs to specify everything so that no matter what happens, his twin brother knows what he's supposed to do. So it needs to specify this is what you do if player 1 plays heads, and this is what you do if player 1 plays tails. That needs to be specified. That should be a T. In general, a contingent plan must specify for each node that a player has the action that the player can take at that node. That will be a contingent plan. And this means that in extensive form games, there is a difference between a strategy and an action. So far, we have been using these relatively interchangeably, and in simultaneous move games, since each player moves only once, we don't have to distinguish between the two. But now we do in extensive form games. So an action is a choice available at a particular node to a player, but a strategy includes these contingency plans. So it needs to be a plan or a set of actions that assigns an action to each decision node of player I. In other words, we don't just want to know what was played in the game, but we also need to know what would have been played. So if the twin brother goes and player 1 plays heads, and player 2, the twin brother player 2, plays tails, we need to know more. We don't just want to know, okay, player 2 played tails and this is the outcome. We want to know what player 2 would have played if player 1 had played something else, tails, for example. So that means that we actually have a few more strategies than we do actions. So here, try to write down what the pure strategies of player 1 are. Well, because player 1 goes first, this part is straightforward. There are only 2 pure strategies, heads and tails. But now, I don't want just the actions of player 2, I want the pure strategies of player 2. And remember, they must include these contingent plans. So write down all the pure strategies of player 2. Pause the video now if you need. Well, there are 4 pure strategies for player 2 in this extensive form game. They are HH, HT, TH, and TT, with capital letters depicting what would have been played if player 1 plays heads, and the small letters depicting what would have been played if player 1 plays tails. You can also think about this in this way. What possible set of instructions can player 2 give his brother? How many possible sets of instructions could there be to give to his brother? Well, remember, the instructions say this is what you do if player 1 does heads, and this is what you do if player 1 does tails. Now, there are 2 possible answers to the first question, and there are 2 possible answers to the second question. So overall, there are 4 possible sets of instructions, 4 possible contingent plans or pure strategies for player 2. So let's say now that player 2 decides to give a contingent plan to his twin brother, who will play sequential matching pennies for him. There are 2 ways to determine an optimal course of action. Player 2 can think beforehand, okay, what are the best sets of instructions or contingent plans against this particular strategy of player 1? And I'll write those down. The second way to think about it, well, player 2's twin brother can determine during the game, while it's going, whether or not an action is optimal when he reaches a decision. Now, if a contingent plan is the optimal one, the twin brother must also find it optimal. So if the twin brother reaches a decision point, sees I have 2 options, can see which one is best, it must match what the brother gave him in the first place, and vice versa. So in other words, instead of thinking about the optimal action at a given node, which is the way the twin brother's thinking, it must match what the optimal contingent plan is anyway. So we can think about this in terms of the optimal contingent plan. But the contingent plans that player 2 writes down for his brother are written before the game has even started, before he has even observed player 1's actions. So we can think about it then in terms of it being a simultaneous move game, because player 2 is writing down these optimal contingent plans before the game has even commenced. Sounds confusing. It's a little bit easier to see by way of an example. So here we have the game tree, and here we have kind of a very long payoff matrix. And the reason it's longer than before is because player 2 has got 4 different pure strategies, or 4 different contingent plans, or 4 different sets of instructions he can give his twin brother. And now we should write down what these payoffs are going to be, noting that there will be a lot of copy-pasting happening here, because some of these contingency plans only differ by things that may not actually occur, so the payoffs will be the same. Okay, if player 1 plays heads, and player 2's plan says if heads, play heads, and if tails, play heads. What does that mean? Player 1 plays heads, and player 2's plan says if heads, play heads, and if tails, play heads. But we never reach this point over here. This is where we end up, and we put that payoff down here, 1 minus 1. We get the same payoff under the strategy HT, because this says we still have heads for player 1, so we still move down this branch. This says if heads, play heads, so we still end up at this terminal node. The difference is now this is what would have happened if player 1 played tails. But the resulting payoff, what actually does happen, doesn't change between these two. Let's look at the third column, the third cell, in the row. If player 1 plays heads and player 2 has TH, this says if heads, play tails, and that actually happens, so we end up in this payoff here. And if tails was played, play heads, but this doesn't actually happen. We're going to get the same payoff here over here, because the only difference is the off equilibrium point here, this T. So this little line here is going to change now. We'll get rid of that, and it's going to change to this line here. But that's not going to affect where we end up. So we're going to get the same payoff here. And we can do the same for all of the possible outcomes where player 1 starts with tails, which is the second row here, and when we fill those out, it looks like this. And notice again, there is some copy pasting. This guy and this guy are the same, and this guy and this guy are the same. Okay, so now some definitions. A Nash equilibrium of an extensive form game is a Nash equilibrium of the normal form game associated with the extensive form game. And this is a very nice definition for us, because what it tells us is that when we have these sort of complicated game trees, we can rewrite them into our elongated payoff matrix, solve that the normal way for Nash equilibria, and know that any equilibria we find there are going to be the same as those in the tree itself. So we draw the normal form equivalent of the sequential matching pennies game, and now we try to solve this for equilibrium. So try to find the Nash equilibrium of this game, the pure strategies Nash equilibrium of this game. Pause your video now. Well, when we do this, we'll find that there are two pure strategy Nash equilibria. They are player 1 plays heads and player 2 plays tails if heads and heads if tails. The second one is player 1 plays tails and player 2 plays tails if heads and heads if tails. The key point is that player 2 strategy tails heads is simply just the best by far. In fact, if you wanted to give instructions to your twin brother, you would say exactly this. If player 1 plays heads, we want to do the opposite of player 1, so play tails. If player 1 plays tails, play heads. So player 2 is going to win no matter what. Well, his brother's going to win. As far as player 1's concerned, there's nothing that player 1 can do to escape this situation. Player 1's got the disadvantage of going first. So player 1 may as well play heads or may as well play tails. Can't do any better. If he plays one of those, there's no reason to deviate. And that's why we end up with these two Nash equilibria. What about the father and son game? See if you can write this out in its normal form equivalent. Pause the video now. Well, if player 1, the son, chooses to end the relationship, and the father chooses to disinherit, then we're going to end up with a payoff of 1, 2, because the son has essentially ended the game as well. The father never reaches this decision node. And that means we get the same payoff whether or not the father disinherits or accepts if the son ends. We get two different payoffs. If the son continues, then the father's choice does matter. So we end up with a payoff matrix like this. So now solve this and come up with the pure strategy Nash equilibria. Pause the video now. Well, there are two pure strategy Nash equilibria here: end, disinherit, and continue, accept. But somehow, even though there are two Nash equilibria, the one that starts with the son ending and the father disinheriting doesn't feel quite right, doesn't feel quite logical. Because if the son was to mistakenly perhaps continue the relationship, the father was essentially bluffing. The father doesn't really want to disown the son. He would rather keep his son even with that terrible girlfriend than to lose his son. What that means is that the father's bluff isn't credible. So we call the threat of disinheriting in this case non-credible. And what that means is that if the son ignores the threat and continues the relationship, the father's not going to follow through on his threat. And we really want to narrow down our Nash equilibria and just focus on those that do not involve these bluffs or non-credible threats and promises. So what do we need to do to make this sort of refinement? What are we missing? Well, the reason that this disinheriting or disavowing is considered optimal against continue is because we were only considering the payoffs at the very beginning of the game, but we didn't take into account comparing the payoffs from disinherit and accept in the contingency plan where the son chooses to continue. So what we really want then is to consider the payoffs from strategies conditional on reaching a particular decision node. And in that case, we can get away from this problem of solving for pure strategy Nash equilibria in the elongated normal form payoff matrix. And that problem is that it compares payoffs sort of throughout time, throughout turns in the decision tree, without capturing the essence of the structure of the tree. So in an extensive form game with perfect information, we consider the game that flows from each dot, from each decision node, as a subgame. In the following sense: if you take the part of the tree after that subgame, like as if you were pruning a tree, so you chop it off at that particular node, you get a smaller extensive form game with perfect information, just like you can get sort of a small version of a tree when you cut off at some particular branch. Now, by definition, the whole game is always a sub-game, but let's try to work out how to do this sort of cutting. So we're going to get a bit of a strange looking tree here. This is known as the centipede game. Player 1 has a choice at the start to quit the game or continue with the game. Then it's player 2's turn. They can quit the game. D means go down in this case, but that means to quit the game. Player 2's actions have capital letters, you can see. Player 1's actions have lowercase letters. So player 2 can go across or go down for player 2's first choice. So the little one here means that it's player 2's first choice, whereas this 2 here means that it's player 1's second choice to go across or go down, and then player 2 finishes the game one way or the other. So let's imagine that we've got some strategy profile, which is the red one here. So it must specify what player 1 does at all of his decision nodes, and it must specify what player 2 does at all of her decision nodes. So here, player 1 is playing down in the first choice and across in the second. Player 2 is playing across in the first choice and down in player 2's second choice. So let's consider what the strategy profile would be in each sub-game under this strategy profile S. So let's find the smallest mini tree that we can find. We'll go to the last node and we'll chop the game off there. So when we chop that off, we end up with just this, just 2 leaves at the end. And here there is only one strategy that exists. It's for player 2 playing the action D2. What about if we go back further and we cut off the tree here at the second to last node? Well, now at this second to last node, at one's second node, in fact, we've got that player 1 is playing A2 and player 2 is playing D2. So that's the strategy profile that is left in this subgame. So this whole thing here is a subgame. If we cut it off at player 2's first node, we have another subgame. So this is another subgame, and in this subgame, the strategy profile is player 1 plays A2. We always want to start with player 1's strategy profile when it exists. It didn't exist at all in the first game, but here we've got player 1, player 2. So here we've got player 1's strategy profile, player 2's strategy profile. So player 2's strategy profile starts with A1, so playing across in player 2's first node and playing down in player 2's second node. And the whole game is also a subgame, and here the strategy profile is player 1 plays down on the first node and across on the second. Player 2 plays across on the first node and down on the second. And we say that S, the full strategy profile, induces these strategy profiles in each respective subgame. Now, why are we going through all this effort to define a subgame? Well, because a subgame helps us to refine our concept of an equilibrium. It gives us a subgame perfect equilibrium. Now, a subgame perfect equilibrium relates to an extensive form game or a game tree, and it's a strategy profile that induces a Nash equilibrium for the whole game, but also induces a Nash equilibrium in every subgame in that game. So it's a very special sort of Nash equilibrium. So when we considered the father-son game, in which there were two Nash equilibria, if we look at the one where the son continues the relationship and the father accepts the relationship, so continue and A, that's subgame perfect, because in this game there are two subgames. The first is the whole game. I'll draw that here. So that's one subgame, because the whole game is always a subgame. And the second subgame is if we cut off the tree at the father's decision node. So basically we make, let's see if I can draw it. This here is the second subgame. And if we look at that second subgame, the father is definitely going to choose accept if we just started the game here. So this strategy profile is subgame perfect because we know it's a Nash equilibrium of the whole game, and in the one subgame that exists, the father is doing the right thing, or at least the rational thing in this game. What about the other Nash equilibrium that we found? Well, this is a non-subgame perfect equilibrium, because even though it is a Nash equilibrium of the whole game, if we just look at the second subgame, it doesn't make any sense. The father is not playing rationally, and that's because his threat is not credible. So subgame perfection as a refinement of Nash equilibrium eliminates non-credible threats. And that's important for us. It means that a player's choice at each node must be optimal given the strategies of other people. And what that means is that the set of subgame perfect equilibria has to be contained within the set of Nash equilibria. We can find many Nash equilibria, but perhaps only one or sometimes more than one can be subgame perfect, but we cannot have more subgame perfect equilibria than Nash equilibria. So not every Nash equilibrium is a subgame perfect equilibrium. So how do we find them? Well, in the very simple father-son game, it was quite straightforward. But even in a more complicated tree, it's still systematically easy to find a subgame perfect equilibrium. What we do, just as in the Pirates game, we go backwards. We call this this technique backward induction. So we go to the last decision node or the set of last decision nodes. We find the optimal action that's done there, and then we take that payoff back to that decision node and replace it essentially. So replace that decision with the optimal payoff that would have happened from that decision, and then keep pruning the tree backwards until we get to the very root of the tree, which will give us not only the exact path to the equilibrium outcome, but also the payoff there as well. So this algorithm is called backward induction. Very simple in the father-son game, but also very simple in a more complicated game. So this is the more complicated game tree we saw earlier. We want to start with the terminal nodes. So we'll start at this subgame here, and we're really interested in what player 3 would do, because player 3 has to choose at this node, which means we're very interested in player 3's payoffs. So the bottom row here, 3, 1, or 2. 3 is the best. So player 3 will choose A if we get here, which means that we can already replace at this node the payoff. So we can take 3, 0, 3, and we can already throw them in there because we know that that's what player 3 will do if player 3 gets hit. Let's go to the other terminal nodes now. Here it's player 1's choice, which means we're interested in the top row, 0 and 2. Player 1 does best by choosing Y, so we can put Y in there, and we can take these payoffs for everyone and put them up here. And at the last set of terminal nodes, it's again player 3's decision, so we're comparing between 4 and 0. 4 is higher for player 3, so player 3 will play up. Okay, we keep going backwards. We keep pruning up the tree. So we'll go to the next decision node, which is for player 2. And how does player 2 choose what to do? Well, we already know what the subsequent players are going to do further down the tree. We know that we're going to end up either at these payoffs or at these payoffs. So player 2 is essentially choosing between 2 and 4 as her payoffs. She doesn't have to consider these guys. She doesn't have to consider these guys because we're not going to get there. She knows that her opponents are going to play optimally given her choice. So the choice is between 2 and 4. 4 is higher, and so therefore player 2 is going to choose R. And then we can take it one step further and go all the way to the root node where it's player 1's choice. Now what's player 1 comparing between? Well, there are lots of different payoffs out there, but player 1 has 3 choices, and even though it's very obvious what's going to happen if player 1 plays out, it's now reasonably clear what's going to happen to player 1 if he plays top or bottom as well, because we know the outcomes already. If he plays top, player 3 is going to play A and player 1 is going to get 3. If he plays bottom, player 2 is going to play R, player 3 is going to play U, and he's going to get 4. So the choice is between 3, 4, and 2. 4 wins, so player 1 plays B. And that gives us the unique subgame perfect equilibrium here, which is player 1 plays B, player 2 plays R, and player 3 plays U. Now that's the path that we go down, but it's not enough to just know what is actually played. Remember, we also need to know what would have been played. And the way that we write what would have been played is we need to say for player 1, this is what player 1's choices would be at every one of player 1's decision nodes. So this is the first decision node, and this is the second decision node, even if we don't actually get there. So that's what this part here means. It's what player 1 should optimally do at the first decision node and the second. At the first, we know it's B. At the second, we know it's Y. So we need both. We need B and Y. Now, player 2 only has one decision node, so we only need to specify R. But again, player 3 has got two decision nodes. At the first one, player 3 is playing A. At the second, player 3 is playing U. So basically, what we need to be able to write down here, we need to be able to convey all the arrows that we find from backward induction method need to be conveyed in how we write the unique subgame perfect equilibrium. Okay, a couple of definitions now, a couple of theorems in fact. The first is that the set of subgame perfect equilibria of a finite extensive form game, or a game tree that has an end, with perfect information, is equal to the set of strategy profiles isolated by backward induction. In other words, this method that we just saw will capture all subgame perfect equilibria that exist. And not only that, but every finite extensive form game with perfect information. I keep saying perfect information because we will see in later weeks cases with imperfect information, but for now we don't need to worry about that. So for every game tree with an end, there is a pure strategy subgame perfect equilibrium, at least one. I'll just reiterate that we need to specify the actions at each of the decision nodes, even those that we never actually reach on the equilibrium path. Because if we don't, then we cannot judge whether or not the equilibrium path consists of optimal actions. They're only optimal because of what others would have done if we did something else. So we need to know about those arrows that occur off the equilibrium path as well. For example, let's take another game tree. This is a choice between countries, one to arm themselves or disarm themselves, and the second country is choosing whether to invade or to just stay at home and not invade. I want to see whether you can work out now what the subgame perfect equilibrium is using backward induction. Pause the video now. Well, let's start at each of the the last decision nodes. So not terminal nodes, but the last decision nodes. So for player 2, if player 1 does arm, player 2 can choose between invade and stay. Stay gives or not invade, I should say. So not invading is better than invading. So player 2 is going to choose to stay. And over here, player 2 is going to choose to invade because 1 beats 0. So player 2 invades. Player 1 now chooses between arm or disarm and is considering a choice between 0 and -2. Player 1 chooses to arm. So player 1 spends money on weaponry even though he doesn't actually use it. And that's the one subgame perfect equilibrium. Player 1 does arm. Player 2 chooses stay if arm and invade if disarm. And it's quite naive to be able to say, well, why should country 1 spend money on weaponry even if he's never actually going to use it because country 2 is not invading? Well, it's because of this off equilibrium threat here. If instead we didn't have this arrow, but we had the arrow going down here saying that player 2 chooses to stay, then sure, country 1 shouldn't arm at all. But it's exactly because of this thing that never actually happens here, this off equilibrium threat, that player 1 must choose to arm, and that we have the subgame perfect equilibrium. And this brings us to a key difference here between equilibrium and equilibrium outcome. They're reasonably similar concepts in our simultaneous move games that we've seen in previous weeks, but they're very different things in extensive form games. An equilibrium is a strategy profile. It must tell us what each player does at each possible contingency of the game, whether or not it actually occurs. We need to know what would have happened at these places. We need to specify the action of each player at every one of his or her decision nodes. Now the outcome is what happens if we follow the arrows from the root down to the leaf. So it's actually what happens. Another thing to call it is the final outcome at the equilibrium path. So if we want to specify an outcome, we just need to know what happens at those nodes to reach it there. So the subgame perfect outcome is indeed country 1 arms and country 2 decides not to invade. But it's this extra feature here that country 2 would have invaded if country 1 would have chosen not to arm. That specifies what the unique subgame perfect equilibrium is. It's the full strategy profile. So let's see a very simple application that has actually occurred many times in history of modern and medieval warfare. We've got country A choosing whether to launch a strong or a weak attack against country B. Now, country A has got boats, country B doesn't have boats. So country A's got a naval fleet, is preparing to attack. Country B has a little castle on an island, a little fort on an island here, joined by a bridge to the rest of country B. Now country A chooses first to launch a strong attack or a weak attack. And upon seeing how strong the attack is going to be, country B decides whether to defend or to retreat. We can write the game like this, with country A deciding what to do first. This is defend, retreat for country B. And here are the payoffs. If country A does a strong attack and country B defends, everybody loses, -2 to country A, -1 to country B. If country B retreats, it's good news for country A, it gets the spoils of the castle. Country B doesn't suffer the losses of war, gets 0. If A does a weak attack and country B defends, country B actually successfully defends the castle and gets 1 versus -1 for country A. And if country B retreats, then it's great news for country A, who gets the castle but also doesn't have to use up so many soldiers. Find a subgame perfect equilibrium of this game. Pause the video now. Well, let's start at our last decision nodes. If country A launches a strong attack, then for country B the choice is between 0 or 1. Basically country B doesn't want to engage, so country B retreats. If A launches a weak attack, then country B actually sees 1 versus 0 and says, well, I better off defend. So now the choice for country A is between getting 1 or -1. 1 wins, so country A launches a strong attack and country B retreats. We can write the subgame perfect equilibrium as strong for A and retreat or defend for B, depending on which decision node. Notice that this is the full subgame perfect equilibrium. The equilibrium outcome, on the other hand, is strong retreat. That's the equilibrium outcome. So what's country B's equilibrium payoff in this case? Well, it's 0. It's this one here from the outcome of a strong attack and a retreat. It's not great for country B, and somehow it feels like country B should have been able to do better. Actually, this situation has been seen in many different contexts throughout history, throughout warfare, and several generals have come up with very smart solutions to this problem. So country A is deciding whether or not to launch a strong attack or a weak attack. I want you to think of something that country B can do before country A decides. What can country B do in order to get a better outcome? Try to think creatively. Think of a few different options, if you will. It's not something super creative like very quickly develop the technology of nuclear weapons or something like this, okay? It's something to do with this game. It's to do with the diagram I gave you at the start. Country B can do better. Think of a way to alter the game tree in such a way that the subgame perfect equilibrium is in B's favor. Pause the video now. Well, this was actually seen in several examples throughout history. One of the reasons that many words in English have a lot of Latin roots to them is because the Roman Empire occupied Britain for a long period of time. And in fact, one of the successful invasions by the Romans into Britannia at the time, which led to this occupation and which led to these Latin roots in our language today, may never have happened if it wasn't for a general working out how to solve this exact sort of game. Basically, what happened was, I think it was in the time of Diocletian, although I cannot remember the general's name, who landed with his navy ships at the coast of Britain and then was dismayed to discover that the local native army was a bit stronger than expected. And they were waiting for him to decide whether or not to attack them or to turn around and go back to the mainland, to the Roman Empire, which was at that time constrained to most of continental Europe and northern Africa. Now, that was already a very large empire, the largest that the world had ever seen. So it would make sense in the face of much stronger opposition for the Roman general to say, okay, didn't expect this, let's go back to Europe. But instead, what the general did was he actually burnt the boats. He said to his troops, burn the boats and burn them in a massive bonfire here on the coast. Now, there were two reasons that he did that. The first was to encourage his troops to fight with all their might. If the troops expected there was a chance that retreat would actually happen, then they wouldn't go 100% into the attack. They would hold back, hoping that they wouldn't be killed on the front line, and hoping that the general would announce the signal to retreat back to the boats. They needed to be ready for that eventuality. The second reason, besides motivating his own troops, was to send a big, bright, burning signal to the Britain army, the local army, to say, we are not retreating. We don't have that option anymore. We are definitely attacking. And the Britons decided to settle and allow themselves to be occupied. In the same way, country B in our game could burn their bridge, could turn around and burn their bridge. And if they did that, if they took away that option, the game tree now looks like this, where no matter what country A does, country B has no choice but to defend because retreat is not an option, as the saying goes. What's the equilibrium of this game now? Well, this game is very easy to solve. Country A can only mount a weak attack, and country B will successfully defend it in this case. Probably country A will not mount much of an attack at all. And the equilibrium payoff now for country B is 1, much more than it was before. And this lesson has actually been seen in many different contexts. For those who've ever read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, he also talks about this. He says that when you're on the attack and you have the advantage in a military situation, don't press on your enemy if he's cornered, if he doesn't have a way out or a retreat. Give him an option to escape, and that way you don't lose troops and resources from a bloody context. We also say sometimes the phrase, never attack a wounded dog, or cornered dog, I think it is, because they have no option but to fight back. So what that means is that even though in normal choice theory, consumer theory of microeconomics, having more choices always makes you weakly better off, because you can always ignore those extra choices. In a game of strategic interaction, having more choices can actually be worse for you. And the reason is that country B would like to say that it will defend until the last soldier, but if you've got that extra choice of retreat, the threat is non-credible. If we want a subgame perfect equilibrium of the game, then we need an equilibrium where we don't have these non-credible threats. And the way to do that is to remove these choices. So burning your bridges or destroying your options can be profitable in strategic interactions, but it can also help with other dilemmas. Sometimes when you're not competing against other people, but actually competing against yourself. And it's been used in recent times by psychologists as some form of commitment device. And there's an interesting application of that online. It's an application called Stick. And basically, it's a game where you're competing against yourself in the future. Now, probably you're well aware of the concept of procrastination, the fact that you plan to do something in the future, but your future self just doesn't stick to it. You can use this online thing to commit to exercising regularly, losing weight, quitting smoking, making sure you study in time for your exams and keep up with my fabulous lecture notes, that sort of stuff. And the way to commit is actually by pledging money. So if you fail, if you don't do what you've said that you will commit to do, that money will go towards a friend. You can do it with your friends. You can do it towards a charity. That money will go towards charity. Or, and what the company has found has been very persuasive, you can pledge that if you don't, say, for example, keep up with your textbook readings, then that money will go to someone that you don't like as well. And that can be quite a motivator. Okay, so what have we seen today? Well, many games are not just simultaneous, but they also involve sequential moves, and we can represent those by game trees, which are reasonably easy to draw. From a game tree, we can then write a sort of elongated normal form, which we can use to identify Nash equilibria. But now we've seen a refinement of Nash equilibrium, we can identify subgames and a subgame perfect equilibrium. And there will always be at least one of those that we can find using backward induction from our game tree. And we've also seen some applications about how game theory can help you in your future careers, whether you are a pirate, a Roman naval general, or just trying to quit smoking. Finally, to just recap the announcement, don't forget that the mid-semester exam is coming up in a few weeks' time, and it will cover lectures 1 through to this one inclusive. All right, that's all for this week. I'll see you next time.